Chapter 13 of Bonds Part 2. Rarity's reflection pouted back at her as she held up first one scarf, then another. The chill in the air had grown more prominent over the past 3 days, and even with every window tied shut and the fire crackling in the hearth downstairs, she had been reluctant to leave the warm embrace of her bedsheets. But she'd been feeling rather cramped staying inside discussing strategy with Whitehorn, and today was Sunday. The Commoners Guild would be holding their primary meeting for the week, and she had every intent to attend. After she had sorted her outfit out, of course. She had thought long over precisely what impression she wanted to impart. She didn't want to wear a dress, for if her experience with Applejack was any indication, workhorses tended to look down upon proper fashion. She wanted to appear familiar, approachable, but not so much so that she would be dismissed as just another mare. She had to carefully thread the needle between being pretentiously outstanding and being forgettably common. She wanted to present herself as a noble, but she must also appear truly sympathetic to the concerns of the commoner. Luckily, the weather had done some of the thinking for her. She wore a cloak of striking burgundy, the hood trimmed with wispy white wool, over the very sort of drab brown jerkin that appeared popular among the working class. Of course, she had taken the time to embroider the simple cloth with some more vibrant colors and intricate patterns, but she hoped no pony would mind, as long as she didn't go too far with the personal enhancements. All that was left was to choose a scarf. The chiffon matched the trim on her hood quite well, but she was always partial to any shade of purple that complemented her mane.
"My lady?"
Pontius called from out in the hall.
"Are you ready yet?"
"Didn't your mother ever teach you not to rush a lady, Pontius?"
Rarity called back, turning to face the door. A few seconds passed before he answered.
"It'll be getting dark, my lady. If we don't depart soon, the meeting might be over by the time we arrive."
With a dramatic sigh, Rarity muttered,
"Oh, very well, then."
She reached out with her magic, pulling the door open and brandishing her 2 scarves.
"I require your assistance, my sweet. Do you think I should go with the chiffon or the mulberry?"
Pontius blinked. His eyes darted from one to the other. Rarity rolled her eyes.
"Chiffon. Mulberry."
She gave a soft shake to each respective scarf as she named them. "The chiffon?" Pontius let out a sigh of relief as Rarity gave a little nod and wrapped the chosen apparel around her neck. "It matches the wool of your hood quite well."
"Oh, my."
Rarity giggled as she levitated the remaining scarf back into her luggage.
"Perhaps I'll make a fashionista of you yet."
Pontius answered her with an uncertain smile. "But I'm a stallion, my lady."
"Oh, pfft."
Rarity scoffed as she stepped out into the hall and closed the bedroom door behind her.
"It's a gender-neutral term, darling. Did the others send you to check on me? I wasn't taking too long, was I?"
Descending the stairs, Rarity greeted Pinkie Pie and Whitehorn waiting patiently in the common room with a bright smile. They had pushed the table aside to make more room for pillows around the hearth, the blue coat keeping watch from the kitchen area, eyeing the flames with obvious envy. Whitehorn was wearing a short cloak over his vest, the sleeves of a shirt unrolled for once, and Pinkie had a cherry red shawl draped over her shoulders for warmth.
"Oh, she's finally ready!"
Pinkie pushed herself up off the cushion she'd been lying on with an energetic wave.
"Rarity, I hope you're ready to make some new friends."
"And new connections," Whitehorn added, dipping his head in greeting.
"I just hope it's not too late,"
Rarity said with a sigh.
"It seems every day there's a little more venom in the eyes of every Frieslander I pass."
Pontius grunted as he took up a spot by the fire, his polished breastplate catching the flickering yellow light. "I don't see what help you hope to get from commoners. They hold no power to accomplish anything."
"Perhaps not officially, no,"
Rarity said, looking to Whitehorn with a hopeful smile.
"But a wise pony once told me that pressure flows both ways."
Whitehorn returned to the smile warmly. You're too kind, Countess. Pontius stepped between them, clearing his throat intently as he nodded towards the door.
Well, seeing as preparations seem to be made, best we set forth before dusk.
He reached for the door, only to flinch back as Captain Piaf barreled through it from the other side, narrowly missing his muzzle.
Apologies, Pontius.
Piaf smiled a greeting around the room, taking her hat off with a flourish.
You lot about to head out? Commoners Guild, yes?
Rarity nodded.
We discussed the escort and curfew yesterday, no? We did, but I'm afraid there's been a slight change of plans.
Piaf hung her coat by the door, exposing the ruffled white shirt underneath and the small saddlebag tied close to her side, and made for the liquor cabinet as she spoke.
New orders, you see. I'm only to let you out 2 at a time from now on.
Pontius was first to react, his voice hard.
And what exactly have we done to deserve such restriction?
You're asking the wrong mare, love.
Piaf shrugged before pulling a bottle out of the cabinet and pouring its clear contents into a glass.
I just follow orders. If I had to guess, I'd say that Governor Ray is concerned for your well-being. There's an awful lot of ill will towards Baronlanders floating around right now, and the best way to avoid any incidents is to ensure you're well guarded.
Rarity let out an unladylike snort.
Oh, well watched, you mean? Don't take it personal, Countess. Every precaution must be taken in times such as these.
Piaf settled onto a cushion near the table with a relieved sigh.
You could put on a blue coat and kill a dozen Baronlanders, and I doubt it'd make any difference.
Rarity's tail flicked behind her.
I wasn't aware I was such an untrustworthy mare.
Piaf smirked as she poured the clear liquid into her glass.
It's not that you're untrustworthy, love. We just aren't very trusting.
Rarity pursed her lips but said nothing. After the deadly attack on the city 2 days ago, she couldn't really blame the Frieslanders for being suspicious of her party. That airship hadn't hijacked itself after all, and Rarity still hadn't told anyone but Pinky about the brief sight of Gava and Anna escaping just seconds before the blast. She had meant to speak to Whitehorn about it, but she'd been unable to get him alone without a blue coat within earshot. They were still out there somewhere, playing some game that she couldn't understand. What did they get out of terrorizing a city under siege? Had they given up on chasing her and her friends? And when would they strike next?
I do have some good news, however.
Piaf reached a hoof into her saddlebag, pulling out a trio of scrolls. 2 of them were sealed with red wax, marked with the pike and shield crest of Duke Titus, but Rarity barely noticed them lying next to the 3rd scroll, the parchment tied shut with strands of long pink hair. Pontius's hard frown faltered as he saw the letters.
Correspondence from my father?
And from Fluttershy!
Pinky giggled gleefully as she rushed forwards, hooking the scroll on the tip of her forelock. With a shake of her head, the scroll unfurled, and her eyes darted left to right across the message within as she hummed a cheery tune. Pontius and Whitehorn picked up their respective letters as well, each of them shooting confused glances at the pink mare, while Rarity moved to Pinky's side with nervous relief.
Dear friends, I'm glad to hear that you're all safe inside the city. We saw the explosion from here in the camp, and we were all so worried that you might have been hurt. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to write sooner, but Brownie and I have been so busy ever since the attack on our camp. We're being careful not to overdo it, so please don't worry about us. I'd hate to distract you from your important business with the governor.
Rarity snorted, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was just like Fluttershy to be more concerned about distracting others with danger to herself than she was about the actual danger.
I hope you're able to make a breakthrough soon. More ponies are hurt every day, and we work so hard to make them better. But sometimes they just come back hurt again. Or worse. I'm seeing so many terrible things, girls. But I don't feel anything. It scares me. But I'm doing my best to be strong. I feel more useful here than I have in a long time.
The smile turned to a frown. It was a cruel irony that Fluttershy, the softest of all of them, would be the one to find some solace in a tent full of wounded ponies. But there was a part of Rarity that envied her. It would be nice to lay her head to rest every night without the troubling thoughts that plagued her, that it was all hopeless, that she wasn't making a difference. Rarity shook her head, closing her eyes. She was making a difference, however slight. With a soft sigh, she turned her attention back to the letter.
Please don't give up. I don't want to stress you, but if we fail here, then a lot more ponies are going to get hurt. I'd appreciate it if you could keep writing if you can find the time. I have to go now, but I'll be thinking of you all. Fondly, Fluttershy.
Rarity let out the breath she'd been holding, feeling much of the tension bottled up inside her melt away. Fluttershy was well, or at least as well as could be expected, given the circumstances. She looked at Pinkie with a wide smile, seeing her own relief beamed back at her in return. Whitehorn stood up, folding his letter up and slipping it into his shirt pocket. Good news, Phillies? A beat passed as Pinkie sucked in a deep breath, belting out her next words in a lilting sing-song.
Fluttershy's okay! Woo! What about your letters?
Rarity asked, looking from Whitehorn to Pontius. Pontius's eyes flicked up to meet Rarity's for only a second before returning to the letter, his brow furrowed with consternation.
Nothing unexpected. The Duke clearly thinks we're wasting our time here. He requests I return to his side before he presses the siege.
Rarity's smile faltered at the indecision in the young stallion's voice.
You know I wouldn't hold it against you if you left, darling.
He met her gaze, his eyes hardening as he gave a firm shake of his head.
Nay, so long as you're willing to continue the fight, so shall I.
Rarity's smile returned.
That's very sweet of you, Pontius.
He nodded, the corner of his lips twitching up in turn. Whitehorn cleared his throat.
Assuming we're still planning on attending this evening's meeting, we really should be going.
But only two of you,
Piaf said.
And you'll have an escort.
Of course.
Whitehorn dipped his head courteously before turning to Rarity expectantly.
I think it's obvious that the Countess should be one of the attendants. But who shall be your second, my lady?
Rarity pursed her lips, looking between her three companions in turn. Pinkie would probably be a priceless asset in a room full of commoners, and could quickly sway any animosity against them based on their class or origins, but there was a chance that the stressed Frieslanders wouldn't respond well to her particular brand of socializing. Pontius was eager as well, both to impress her and to stop the war, but the son of the very stallion besieging the city was unlikely to be welcome. Then there was Whitehorn. Polite, well-spoken, and the most seasoned among those present with regards to modern politics. If any of them might be able to walk into a room full of commoners and find the pressure point that would stop this war, it would be him. And maybe she'd finally be able to speak to him without a bluecoat listening in, and see what he thought about Anna and Gava's presence in the city.
As much as it pains me to leave you two behind, I think it would be best if Whitehorn accompanied me to this meeting,
she said.
Aww.
Pinkie kicked a hoof at the floor in dejection.
I wanted to go. Maybe next time, Pinkie.
Rarity drew Pinkie into a quick hug.
Would you be a dear and write our response to Fluttershy for us?
She brightened up at that.
Oh, okay. I have the perfect thing.
With the clatter of her wheels and a fit of giggling, Pinkie zipped upstairs, leaving only a thin cloud of confetti in her wake. Rarity turned to Pontius next.
You understand, right?
Aye, I understand.
He gave a short nod before starting up the stairs himself.
I'd best write to my father. Be careful, my lady.
Rarity's brow furrowed in concern as she watched him ascend the steps, but there was nothing to be done at the moment about any hurt feelings he might have. Instead, she started for the door, glancing to Whitehorn as she did.
Shall we depart then, darling?
At your pleasure, Countess.
The wind was picking up as they stepped out into the streets of Friesland, carrying with it the distant scent of smoke and blood from the siege lines. It was early evening, and the sun was just visible above the surrounding buildings, its light broken only by the occasional airship casting a long shadow over the city below. A pair of blue coats were leaning against a building across the street, and they fell in behind the duo without a word.
So much for getting time alone,
Rarity thought, giving the soldiers a small smile. They ignored the expression, the sharpened horns fitted to their helmets gleaming in the sunlight. The atmosphere of the city was a distant shadow of the warm bustle that had first greeted Rarity at the start of this siege. Gone were the throngs of careless ponies going about their business with little care for the army parked outside their walls. Civilian traffic was thin, and what pony she did see walked at a hurried pace, their eyes sometimes flicking upwards when an airship's shadow passed overhead. Those who didn't keep their gazes forwards would glare at Rarity or Whitehorn with undisguised contempt, tails flicking and ears flattening whenever she tried to answer their suspicious gazes with a disarming smile or a dip of her head. The distant boom of the cannons rolled over them as they passed through the courtyard in the center of the city and turned north, towards the residential district, where many of the dock workers and other laborers lived. The colorful market stalls that had proudly displayed their wares when Rarity came to speak to the governor were mostly gone at this time, with most merchants who still remained so late packing up their goods in tired silence. Opposite the cathedral, a line of ponies were waiting outside the old stone guard tower, filing forwards one at a time to speak to a blue-coat officer at a desk, while another watched in silence.
The pressure is mounting,
Whitehorn observed, leaning in close to be heard over the wind.
That attack has spurred the city into action.
Rarity pursed her lips, stealing a furtive glance back at the two soldiers trailing them. They were scanning the city with bored disinterest, and far enough back that she doubted they'd be able to hear a quiet conversation over the wind. Pulse quickening, Rarity stepped close enough to almost brush soldiers with Whitehorn.
I know who did the attack.
If he was surprised by this information, he did an excellent job of concealing it.
Who?
Gava and Anna.
Rarity kept her eyes forward as she spoke.
I saw them flying away just before the blast.
Curious.
A pause.
And no pony else saw?
Only Pinky and I believe. We were atop the wall, but everyone else had their eyes turned outwards.
Rarity paused to allow a passing pony to walk out of earshot.
What do you think they're up to? What could they possibly have to gain from bombing a city under siege?
Hard to say, Countess, though it often is with mercenaries.
Whitehorn narrowed his eyes as the thundering of cannon shots sounded in the distance.
Perhaps they were hired by the barons to pressure the city into surrender. They helped Duchess Nettlekiss in her attack against Titus, after all.
Rarity grimaced as she thought back to that dark night. Things had finally been looking up, and then they had gone so wrong.
You think they might have turned against her?
I think there are many angles many ponies could play here, and we don't know enough to speculate.
Whitehorn paused, letting out a thoughtful hum.
We could turn this to our advantage, you know.
Rarity blinked.
I'm sorry?
Pressure is good for us, he continued. We want to end this conflict, and if the city's guilds begin to fear for riots or sabotage, then they can pressure Rhea into breaking ties with Nettlekiss and surrendering. There hasn't been much damage done yet. The barons would likely be satisfied with Nettlekiss's execution and would leave the city relatively whole.
Rarity's frown deepened.
The idea of using such a terrible act to advance her own causes made her feel dirty.
But if it would ultimately save lives, perhaps there was some merit to it.
What would we even do?
Whitehorn shrugged.
For now, Bide our time. There are pieces moving on the board and none of them are ours. With luck, however, we may gain some tonight.
Ah, here we are.
What? This?
Rarity looked up at the building before them with a skeptical cock of her head.
This looks like a tavern.
The building did nothing at all to stand out. Amidst an unbroken line of stone-faced storefronts and homes, the only thing unique about the Commoners Guild Hall was the lack of any kind of identifying signage to label it as such. It displayed the same squalid stone facade as its neighbors, and the dim-eyed ponies that sometimes trundled through the doorway, though far quieter than drunk bar patrons, wore the same tired and beaten clothing that she'd caught glimpses of through the open windows of taverns.
Quite sure, yes, Whitehorn said. I've made a few rounds of the city since we've been here, looking for possible allies. This is the place.
He turned to her with a shallow bow, gesturing with a huff and a smile.
After you, Countess.
Walking through the open doorway with a measured stride, Rarity found that the guild house looked even more like a tavern on the inside than it did on the outside. If not for the dull-faced pony seated behind the bar on raised seats, or the lonely podium set up in an open space before them, it would have been impossible to tell the difference. Square stone tables were spread evenly about the main room, with most of the guild members seated close to the two hearths burning on either side, their hooves wrapped protectively around clay mugs or bowls, while a set of stairs off to one side led to a second floor above. A solitary serving mare drifted among the members, the bun of her mane threatening to fall apart as she rushed to answer summons, disappearing only briefly into a door behind the bar, before emerging once more with fresh food and drink balanced on her back. Taking all this in, Rarity shot a confused glance towards Whitehorn.
Are you certain this isn't a bar?
He opened his mouth to answer, but was interrupted by the sudden arrival of River Pie.
You came!
River beamed as she rushed up to Rarity. She stopped a respectful distance away to dip into a quick bow, but she couldn't quite keep her hooves from fidgeting in excitement.
Twinkle was beginning to worry that you'd brushed us off, but I told him you'd said you were interested, and Countess Rarity ain't no liar.
The mare's eager energy was more than enough to bring a smile to Rarity's face, driving her hesitation away.
My apologies that we couldn't attend sooner, darling. Things have been rather hectic since, you know.
River nodded, turning away and beckoning with her tail.
I understand. Come on over here, then. Twinkle and I've got a table back here.
Rarity followed with her head high, ignoring the mixture of curiosity and suspicion aimed her way from some of the tables they passed. Glancing back, she saw that only one of the bluecoats had followed them inside, the mare staring down anyone that dared look towards her. Twinklesmith and River Pie had a table to themselves near the middle of the room, far from the warmth of the fires, but close to the podium. Rarity drew her cloak a little closer as she sat down, noticing for the first time the lack of cushions on the stone, and Whitehorn sat beside her. Their bluecoat escort remained standing, scanning the room with a far more attentive leer than when they'd been out on the street.
Welcome, Countess.
Twinkle kept his voice low as he stretched a hoof out, and Rarity offered hers up for him to briefly embrace before drawing back.
Hope you aren't too uncomfortable inside our humble guild hall?
Rarity answered with a wan smile.
It's quite charming, really. Who are those ponies sitting behind the bar? That's the guild council,
River Pie explained.
Him in the middle's the guild master, Mr. Marks. He represents us in matters with the other guilds and casts our vote for governor during elections. Ah.
Rarity regarded the thick-set earth stallion seated at the center of the bar, on a seat slightly taller than the other four council members. His dull yellow coat was mostly covered by the long gray coat he wore, and he drank out of a glass instead of one of the clay mugs the other guild members used.
So the governor is elected purely by the vote of guildmasters? Aye.
River nodded.
I haven't been in the city very long, so I don't know 'em all yet, but there's dozens of 'em.
Could we speak with him?
Whitehorn asked.
I'll see about getting you a meeting,
Twinkle said, pushing the brim of his hat back with a huff.
It'll have to be after the general meeting, though. Yeah, another hour at least, while the council listens to general petitioners.
He perked up as he saw the serving mare rush past.
Perhaps you'd like a drink?
Oh, no thank you, dear.
Rarity did her best to gather her cloak around her for warmth as she settled in for the wait.
I'll be quite all right. And that poor man looks overworked enough as it is.
The hour passed at a snail's pace, the room growing gradually darker as the sun set outside, until only the flickering light of the candles and the fireplace remained. Several ponies rose to the podium, each one rising up from a table, briefly introducing themselves, and then presenting the council with their problems. Many complained of long hours or low pay, and Mr. Marks promised to speak to the appropriate guildmasters over the matter. Some discussed dangerous working conditions, such as open foundries or unprotected machinery, and again, Mr. Marks assured the speakers that he would see to it. Rarity leaned over to Twinklesmith as one mare told the story of how she'd lost an ear to the gears of a conveyor belt.
How often are these ponies' problems actually solved?
Twinkle shrugged.
Often it's hit or miss. Mr. Marks does what he can, and sometimes we'll see results, but not always. We have to choose our battles if we want to actually get anything done.
Finally, the petitioners ran dry. Most of them left the guild hall shortly after voicing their complaints, and the room was full of empty tables with only a few small parties left in scattered pockets. The room was silent, and all eyes fell on Mr. Marks as he downed the last of his drink and stood. "I'm calling this meeting of the Commoners Guild to a close," he said. He scanned the room with half-lidded eyes, pausing only briefly on Rarity and Whitehorn before moving on. "We shall convene again on the morrow. Until then, take heart and work hard. It's our aching limbs that keeps the barons at bay." He sat back down with a tired groan, and in the same instant, Twinklesmith shot up out of his seat. Mr. Marks!" Mr. Marks sighed. Around him, the other council members busied themselves with gathering their notes and filing upstairs. "Yes, Mr. Smith. I've brought some ponies that need to speak to you." Twinkle stepped forwards, gesturing towards Rarity and Whitehorn with a huff. "Countess Rarity of Cantithusia and Mr. Whitehorn from Highton. They wish to lend us aid in our affairs." Slowly, Mr. Marks turned to regard Rarity and Whitehorn in turn. Rarity stood, dipping into a quick curtsy, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw Whitehorn give a courteous smile. "Very well, then. You may lead them to my office, Mr. Smith." Mr. Marks let out a few low grumbles as he slid out of his seat and made for the stairs. The bar hid most of his body, at first, but the limp in his gait was obvious even still. The cause became clear once he stepped out into the open. One of his hind legs was missing, the metal stump in its place just visible under the shadow of his low-hanging coat. "Let's make it quick, eh?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Twinkle turned to Rarity with a grin. "Well, come on, then. Let's make this count."
Good luck, Countess!
River Pie gave an excited wave as the others stood.
I'll be here holding the table for you.
Rarity frowned.
You aren't going to come, darling?
River shook her head.
I'm nothing important in the guild, Countess. Mr. Marks wouldn't want me getting in the way. Ah, I see.
Rarity gave River a hopeful smile before turning for the stairs.
Well, I shall be sure to fill you in on every detail once we're done then. Ta for now.
The second floor was exactly as Rarity had expected. A single narrow hallway lined on one side with cheap tin doors. It was obvious that the Guild Council's offices were just repurposed inn rooms. Mr. Marks's office was closest to the stairs, and so it only took a brief minute for Rarity, Whitehorn, and Twinklesmith to follow him inside. Their blue-coat escort attempted to enter as well, only to be deterred by a sharp glare from Mr. Marks as he settled onto the deep cushion behind his desk. All right, then. He looked between Rarity and Whitehorn in turn. Cart Marks, Master of the Commoners Guild. What do you want? Rarity exchanged a quick glance with Whitehorn and received an encouraging nod. Rather than take the direct approach, She decided to be more cautious this time.
Well, as our companion here said, I am Countess Rarity, wife to Sir Pontius, son of Duke Titus, who currently leads the Baronlander army.
She paused, giving him time to process her words.
How do you feel about the war, Mr. Marks?
He snorted, reaching under his desk to retrieve a wide bottle of whiskey.
I think if the barons want our city, then they'd best be ready to pay in blood, because Friesland is more than ready to toll them.
His lip curled as he raised the bottle to his lips and took a sip.
It's no wonder they need to resort to bombing granaries, though I hadn't expected them to stoop so low as to do it with their own diplomats in the city talking of peace.
Rarity grimaced.
The bombing was certainly a messy affair, but I do believe it's important to remember that we still don't know who committed the attack. We should refrain from jumping to conclusions.
Another snort, another sip.
What other conclusion is there, Countess? Who else has anything to gain from the attack?
Rarity glanced to Whitehorn, who gave a subtle shake of his head.
Well, it's rather hard to say, but...
But nothing. Bah.
Mr. Marks waved a dismissive hoof in the air.
What do you care for it anyways? Is there some land at stake for you? You nobles are always obsessing over land.
Mr. Marks!
Rarity snapped, her ears flicking back against her head.
I am trying to save lives, and your attitudes towards me is not helping.
You want to save lives?
The stallion shook his head.
Talking isn't going to do it. You need to get out there and get your hooves duty, Countess.
Mr. Marks. Trinklesmith raised a hoof, cutting off Rarity's sharp rebuttal.
The Countess was actually one of the ponies helping at the site of the attack. She's the gift that I told you about, if you remember.
Mr. Marks frowned. He looked to Twinkle, then back to Rarity. His eyes narrowed curiously.
Is that so?
It is so, Whitehorn said.
If there's a single pony on this island who holds the interests of the common citizen above all else, this is the mare.
He paused, giving extra emphasis to his next words.
I'd expect your causes would align, considering your office.
Yes, well... Mr. Marks leaned back against the wall behind him with a sigh.
We pick and choose our battles here. It wasn't easy to protect those dockhookers from retribution after they walked out on their shift, but it had to be done.
This, too, has to be done,
Rarity said, leaning forwards intently.
If we don't stop this conflict before the barons launch an assault on the city, hundreds of ponies could die on both sides of the war. Governor Rhea has been unreceptive to diplomacy, but surely there's something you could do to help.
Me? And the governor's already turned you away?
Mr. Marks arched a brow.
What exactly do you expect me to do? You control the city's labor, do you not?
Whitehorn asked.
Without labor, ships full of supplies cannot be unloaded, factories cannot be run, and repairs cannot be made. A general strike would apply immense pressure.
A general strike? Mr. Marks blinked, his jaw hanging open for a few long seconds. And then he broke down into a deep laugh.
Hold on. Let me get this straight.
He raised a hoof to buy time while his laughter drifted into quiet chuckles.
So you want me to tell a city full of commoners, fresh full of hate for the Baronlanders after a bombing in the very center of their city, to walk out on their jobs and force Rhea to what?
Well...
Rarity hesitated for only a moment.
To surrender, darling. If the city retracts its protection from Duchess Nethelkiss, then...
You want us to surrender a war that we're winning?
Mr. Marks shook his head as the laughter came back in forceful guffaws.
Your goals are admirable, Countess, but letting the barons win this will be the end of Friesland as it stands. We need Nethelkiss grain to keep our dominance, and without it, the barons might actually have a chance of sieging us out.
No, they won't,
Rarity insisted.
I won't let them.
And what will you do? You're the wife of the son of the Duke, not queen of the island. Mr. Marks paused to drink from his bottle before giving a lazy shrug. Even if the city wanted the war to end, calling a strike during wartime is tantamount to treason. I won't have my neck snapped over your lost cause, Countess. The words hung in the air, left unchallenged as Rarity struggled to find an argument. But again, she was useless. Her hoof tips shook in frustration as she looked between Mr. Marks's eyes, searching for some crack in the unyielding facade. She jumped as Whitehorn laid a hoof over hers. It seems we're done here, then. We'll take our leave. Rarity rounded on him, ready to demand otherwise, but the look in his eyes gave her pause. He gave her a slight shake of his head before nodding to the door.
Yes.
She stood stiffly, drawing her cloak around her.
So we shall.
Mr. Marks gave a curt nod. It was good to meet you, Countess. Perhaps in kinder times we might find our positions more agreeable. But until then... He turned to Twinkle Smith. See them out, Mr. Smith. Yes, sir. The walk back down to the main room was made in silence, their blue-coat escort following behind like a stone-faced shadow. The guild hall was almost completely empty now, with only River Pie patiently waiting alone at their table, while a trio of ponies spoke in hushed tones at another. River's hopeful smile faded away as she saw the expression on Rarity's face.
He turned you down, didn't he?
Rarity looked away with a sigh as they approached the table.
I'm sorry. Well, we shouldn't give up hope yet.
River rose out of her seat with an indignant pout.
Perhaps you join Twinkle and I and discuss it over some drinks. I'm sure there's something we can do.
The blue-coat escort cleared her throat. Rarity glanced back to see her gave a slight shake of her head.
I'm afraid no further detours will be allowed, darling,
Rarity said.
Whitehorn and I must return to our lodging, though I'd encourage you to come visit, all right? It always puts a smile on my face to hear from you. Then I shall write you regularly,
River promised. Rarity's lips curled up into a small smile. She reached out with a hoof, pulling the ex-bandit into a quick hug.
I look forward to it. Until then, keep doing as you do. I'm proud of you.
River beamed as Rarity pulled back, but there wasn't any time to relish the moment. Soon, Rarity and Whitehorn were out on the street once more, one bluecoat leading them between the puddles of lantern light while the other brought up the rear. The streets were dead at this time, with only the soldiers stationed at street corners or hawk-eyed patrols disturbing the stillness. The wind had grown stronger as well, and Rarity found herself walking with her cloak's hood pulled low, the breeze pulling the fabric away from her legs in strong gusts. It was bitter weather, but it gave her and Whitehorn a good excuse to walk close enough to share the heat of their bodies, and made it easy for them to speak without their escort overhearing.
I just don't see a way through this, darling,
Rarity said, a shiver passing through her.
Everywhere we go, we face the same obstacles. It was hard enough before, but now with this attack, the Frieslanders are out for blood.
Understandably so, Whitehorn said, though I do have some ideas.
Oh?
Rarity turned to face him. The wind tugged at her forelock, pulling the curl apart into a fluttering wave.
Do tell.
Just some contacts of mine who may be able to assist. Whitehorn met her gaze with a smile, and for a moment, the torchlight reflecting off the lens of his glasses almost seemed to make his eyes glow. I'll let you know how it pans out.